Chapter 9. We Made This. Zethusela had long ago come to see the AI research lab as the perfect home for the countless repetition of soul-destroying, miserable failures that inevitably framed the pursuit of visionary innovation. This project, however, was always destined to travel the expressway to greatness, even if his so-called colleagues still didn't know it yet. In a way, it almost felt like cheating, not that he was in any particular danger of losing sleep over it. Yet, although he had no doubts as to their eventual success, this had been a brutally challenging journey, some several years in the making, so it was difficult not to feel the excitement and anticipation inherent in the moment. He could hardly begin to imagine what it must feel like for the rest of the team, though no doubt their enthusiasm would be heavily tempered, with entirely justifiable skepticism, and perhaps even extending all the way out to naked suspicion. Zethusela viewed the vacuum-sealed construction chamber from the relative comfort of his holographic terminal, while watching a tiny, multi-limbed bot delicately crawl its way across the chamber's floor. Climbing skillfully up an intricate complex of scaffolding and ladders permeating the open space of the theater, it made its way methodically across the complex framework until within a few centimeters of one of 11 small milky gray sacs, held in place by the invisible hands of a magnetic field. Having positioned itself directly below the spherical sac, a circular hatch irised open at the top of the small mechanical bot, and a tiny golden chip floated into view. A brief electromagnetic pulse sent the chip into the grasp of one of its finely clawed hands, while another of its multi-jointed limbs extended out towards the MQB, its tip lighting up with a soft blue glow. The bot now sent a photonic pulse into the mesh quantum brain, cutting a small, perfectly circular hole into its side. It then extended the chip towards the incision and shot it into the sac's interior with femtometer-perfect precision. Less than a second later, the nanofiber quickly knitted itself back together, leaving behind no visible scar or seam. Job apparently complete, the agile little bot nimbly climbed its way down the scaffold as it crossed paths with a much larger unit, which was methodically lumbering its way towards the same small gray sac. The oversized bot, holding tight to a cylindrical vial of hyperdense plasma, proceeded to laser another hole into the side of the MQB. The clamped appendage telescoped upwards as the bot smoothly pushed the small fluorescent tube into the softly glowing interior. It rotated the vial a one-half circle until a tiny shutter ran through the entire length of its arm. The mechanical limb then hastily retracted as the nanofiber quickly knitted itself back together. The large but now unencumbered bot made its way carefully back down to the floor, docking itself at a far corner of the theater. Its limbs retracted into its shell as a side panel irised open. The docking bay then smoothly slid back into a recess in the wall, hatch spiraling closed behind it. The network of scaffolding began to quickly retract, melting away into several anchor points surrounding the periphery of the room. Zethusela had always thought this process looked eerily similar to that of the long tentacled arms of a Zircadian bloatweaver, beating a hasty retreat after securing its prey. The 11 blue-gray sacs, now surrounded by nothing but empty space, began to hover closer together, with the fine silver web of connective cables automatically shrinking in length to compensate. Cecilia, 8506, who was watching the performance play out in the reel, stared intently through a transparent viewport near the top of the primary operations hub.
All right, Zethusela, the triple P neural chip and internal power cell have both been successfully installed, providing secondary confirmation now.
The Shimatiri technologist double-tapped a small, translucent glyph on her holographic HUD, and then turned an almost accusatory glare upon the Shihari scientist.
Well, to my considerable surprise, it would seem that you are free to initiate the post-implementation verification procedures at your nearest convenience. Under the circumstances then, I wonder if it might not be excessively melodramatic of me to declare that your day of reckoning has now officially arrived.
Our day of reckoning,
Zethusela retorted flatly.
And yes, your penchant for melodrama has been duly noted.
The scientist now did his level best to simply ignore her caustic gaze and turned his focus to the data feed in front of him. However, he could not help but wonder why she had felt it so necessary to inform him of what was already so blazingly obvious on the primary operations console.
Well, are you going to initiate the validation protocols or not?
I'm still thinking.
Zethusela replied testily. The humiliating truth of the matter was, he just didn't want to do it while she was still looking. But the problem was that she knew he didn't want to do it while she was still looking, which was, of course, precisely why she was doing it. The Shihari scientist reluctantly reached a shaky hand out to the initiation glyph hovering in front of him, which, sensing the unsteadiness of his hand, automatically doubled in size. He could almost feel her disapproving gaze burning holes into his carapace as he at last initiated the verification process. Screw that sanctimonious bitch, the scientist thought to himself bitterly as he reached into a small leg pouch and pulled out a nondescript bottle full of pills.
Seriously, Zethusela, you really need to get off that stuff, for your sake, as much as for everyone else.
And you really need to get off my back for your sake every bit as much as mine.
He responded reflexively. The Shihari scientist belligerently slugged back a pill and almost immediately started to feel better.
You didn't get those from Dr. Sikatika, did you?
Cecilia asked accusingly.
They are not black market, if that's what you are trying to imply.
She was right, of course, but Dr. Shikatika was not exactly the only game in town, and he was Shihari after all.
Well, I just hope you know what you're doing. But don't worry, I'm not about to stage an intervention. Regardless of what you may think of my concerns for your health, you are still a Shihari, and rightly or wrongly have the inalienable right to ruin your life without any interference from me.
That was true enough. Zethusela had to admit to himself somewhat begrudgingly. For all her nagging, she had never chosen to escalate his drug use to Queen Zetalia. No, whether he cared to admit to it or not, when it came right down to it, the Zimitiri technologist had more than earned his reluctant gratitude for her understated ability to remember her own station. She had, after all, effectively been forced to spend the last 5 years of her life working towards a goal that by his own act of deceit could not possibly make sense. Rather sadly, then, the deception that lay at the heart of the MQB's neural encoding, while born of necessity, did not exactly make him feel good about himself. No, despite their unavoidable friction, Zethusela had always respected the Zimitiri technologist for her brilliant commitment to the AI program. No, it was more than just a little unfortunate that it was only the fact she was very much Zetalia's creature which made them natural adversaries. The reality was that given Zetalia's willingness to break with tradition, by allowing a Zimitiri technologist to climb the ranks of the Nest's intelligentsia without prejudice, Zesila's misplaced loyalty was entirely understandable, and perhaps ultimately even inevitable. Cecilia might be incapable of seeing it, but the ugly truth of the matter was all Zetalia could really be credited with was her equal opportunity policy for exploiting any asset from her own nest, irrespective of status or rank. And of course, on the flip side, it also meant when you were no longer of any value to her overarching goals, there would be absolutely no gratitude afforded. No more than if you were a lifeless mechanical tool that had finally outlived its usefulness. Trust Queen Zetalia to turn her one solitary redeeming feature into something ugly and self-serving. Not that he had ever wasted his time trying to make Cecilia see the truth of it. Her loyalty to Zetalia was as complete as it was unwavering. Very sadly, then, it seemed the only game left on the table was that of ongoing mutual deceit. Yet despite her naivety, Cecilia was not exactly an easy arachnid to deceive, especially when it came to the field of artificial intelligence research. The trick then was to carefully blend fact with fiction. With Dr. Sikatika's help, the fictitious solution behind generating a breakthrough neural network into the MQB was to first perform a highly detailed scan of a real-life brain, in this case that of a Zixolotl clone, using a powerful, purpose-built supercomputer. Once a copy was fully digitally rendered, the actual physical encoding of such a complex 3D neural map, rather fortuitously, took a considerable length of time, which perhaps not so coincidentally lined up very nicely with the need to await the decommissioning of a Zixolotl clone when it was inevitably taken off life support due to the fatal depletion of its own donated organs. A clone that just so happened to be infected with one half of an entangled pair of quantum goo. The fiction sold to Zacilla was that once they had successfully managed to build a complete digital map of a Zicadian brain, it could then be physically rendered into the MQB using an ultra-high-precision X-ray laser. The irony of it was that as far as Zethusela was able to determine, their fictitious solution really could build an apparently flawless replica of the digitally encoded neural network, just not right down to the quantum level. This was due primarily to the uncertainty principle rather than any inherent limitation of their actual toolset. Both he and Dr. Shikataka had already confirmed for themselves that the results of such a brain produced exactly the sort of deeply disappointing incremental improvements that most contemporary AI experts had long ago predicted. Too bad for Zacilla and the rest of the team, then, that this entire process was nothing more than an elaborate smokescreen for the miraculous wave function collapse of the quantum-activated viral agent. Naturally enough, Zacilla remained deeply skeptical regarding this new 11-brained prototype, as well she should, but she was about to be deeply confounded. While nothing would have made Zethusela happier than to have told her the unfettered truth, the harsh reality was, circumstances dictated that it was never going to happen, so Zacilla would always be left on the outside looking in. On the other hand, it wasn't as if he'd had it all his own way either. The development and implementation of the proprietary primary protocol chip had been managed completely outside the sphere of his own influence by virtue of a fully independent sub-team headed by Zacilla, a non-negotiable requirement set down by Queen Zetalia herself. As such, there had been no opportunity for him to interfere with, compromise, or even mildly influence the development process of that archaically disruptive piece of technology. The actual protocols themselves, inhibitor and compeller, presented Zethusela with very different levels of concern. The inhibitor mechanism was akin to an outgoing firewall, blocking any action that violated a protocol, such as, for example, causing intentional physical harm to a Zicadian arachnid. Inhibitors, by their very nature, were in most cases relatively easy to design, test, and implement. In stark contrast, the compeller protocols initiated involuntary autonomic behavior under very specific but sometimes deceptively complex and abstract circumstances, such as, for example, the wildly unpredictable conditions that might be relevant to saving a Zicadian arachnid from imminent risk of serious injury or death. The simple fact of the matter was, compellers were more often than not diabolically difficult to get right. Their design and fine-tuning required an exhaustive amount of field testing before they could reliably perform their intended duties without any unforeseen consequences occasionally slipping through. A real-world cautionary tale often taught to postdoctoral AI graduates involved a third-generation Z-bot that found itself compelled to save a nuclear power plant technician from fatal radiation exposure. As it turned out, the technician was duly saved, but only at the cost of preventing him from shutting the plant down before it went supercritical, resulting in the instant loss of over 1,000 Zicadian lives. A trivial amount, granted, but it still served to highlight the point. Accordingly, then, it was the compeller category that worried Zethusela the most. If by chance Zetalia had actually been reckless enough to instruct Zacilla to cook up some custom, off-the-books compeller protocols, then the risk was very real that they could cause some completely unintended results. The last thing he needed right now was for this project to be shut down by the AI Safety and Ethics Bureau because of Zetalia's uncompromising compulsion to have everything her own way. Try as he might, he simply could not shake a sneaking suspicion that in spite of the fact that the chip's implementation was fully reviewed and audited by an independent representative from the Zicadian AI Safety and Ethics Bureau, Zacilla, under Zetalia's invidious instruction, had still somehow managed to successfully corrupt its operational integrity. The problem was that this was exactly the sort of reckless stunt that he would expect the Queen to try and pull off, and yet was helpless to intervene in. Well, at least Zycilla was more than experienced enough to be all too well aware of the dangers that a poorly designed and tested compeller protocol might pose, if indeed Zitalia had decided to push her in that particular direction. The Shihari scientist discreetly popped another pill and then tried his level best to calm down and steady his nerves. The new Zicadian Series 5, 11-brained Z-Bot, or XAI 511 for short, was now on the very cusp of completion, and there was little point in endlessly worrying about potential problems before they had even arisen. There was little else that he could do now, except simply deal with each issue, if and when they came up. Still, preparing for the worst while you continued to hope for the best was exactly the kind of wise counsel that he had received in abundance from Dr. Zhikatika, and which had undoubtedly played a very large part in getting him this far. Zethusela peered intently into the master console. 11 holographic brains hovered in front of him, all of which now glowed a comforting shade of green. A complex lattice of ethereal silver strands connected the MQBs together, allowing for an unrestricted flow of data and power between them. After taking one final deep breath, he tentatively double-tapped the unit that had just been augmented with both the Triple P chip and superconducting power cell. A sub-menu of options lit up his display, and Zethusela immediately selected a full self-diagnostic of the power delivery system. A short moment later, when the diagnostic returned with success across the board, he went live with the internal power source, and with a slight sense of trepidation, shut off the external supply. Just like that, the She-Bot's mind was now running fully independently via its own dedicated power source. With its newly installed rechargeable superconducting battery, it could theoretically continue to operate indefinitely, perhaps even forever, Zethusela thought hyperbolically to himself. Well, maybe not forever, but really, after a guaranteed 1,000,000 years plus, who would be left to count? The scientist was momentarily overcome with a wave of impotent frustration. There was just so much about this moment that he could not share with the rest of the team. In a very real sense, this was a legitimate resurrection of Zeon, since all Zixolotl clones were sampled from the same genetic zygote. Simply put, this particular arachnid had been bioengineered to be as close to genetically perfect as it was possible for any Zicadian arachnid to be. In other words, you really couldn't improve on perfection, so why even bother trying? By design, then, organs harvested from Zixolotl clones were guaranteed to be uniformly perfect, and while under normal circumstances, the brain itself was essentially irrelevant, it was of rather crucial importance if you just happened to be in the clandestine business of Kava brain cloning. 11 of them, to be exact. 11 genetically identical brains, all working together in harmony as a single unified consciousness. 2 more, Zethusela noted to himself wryly, than the maximum known limit of 9, as witnessed in even the most rare breed of Shihari, apparently because it was what Zitalia's ego had demanded. Cecilia now took her gaze away from the viewport and turned her attention towards Zethusela, who had just made an unusual, almost contemptuous-sounding grunt. He appeared to be deeply engrossed within his own thoughts as he gazed glass-eyed into the holographic display. The secretive scientist's true intentions steadfastly remained an impenetrable enigma in spite of her very best efforts to make sense of the bizarre situation that she had been unceremoniously thrust into the middle of. It seemed all but impossible that this new prototype would actually deliver the sort of fantastical results the scientist was so steadfastly promising, and yet it was very difficult to believe that he was lying, deluded, or even just plain wrong. No, her instincts told her that there had to be a lot more to it than that. Up until his departure to the sanctuary, Zethusela, in spite of his rebellious reputation, had clearly established himself as a preeminent expert in the field of artificial intelligence research. So try as she might, she could not shake the feeling that the entire team had unwittingly become part of a much more significant project than logic suggested they had any right to be. What exactly was she missing here? The whole process had been laid out bare in front of her, and as far as she could tell, Zethusela had not attempted to hide any scientific details in relation to this newest prototype. A prototype, she might add, that had been preemptively labeled fifth generation, and generational increments were supposed to be strictly reserved for a verifiable quantum leap forward in the underlying technology. Yet nothing she had so far seen suggested that they were witnessing anything more than the birth of a higher capacity, faster performing version of the current state-of-the-art fourth-generation Shibot that they already had in abundance. She had waited expectantly during the entire course of the project for the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle to finally fall into place, but it simply never happened. Granted, the MQB was indeed a significant step forward, both in terms of its seemingly limitless capacity and its novel ability to integrate electrochemical signaling. Similarly, the process of transcribing it through the use of a custom ultra-high precision X-ray laser was inarguably an extremely impressive engineering achievement. Yet even so, this equated to little more than a brute force amplification of everything that they could already do, excepting perhaps for the integrated chemical reactions, which was still a largely unexplored feature and therefore also mostly irrelevant. No, there was no generational leap forward to be found here, unless, of course, somewhere along the curvature of speed and complexity, an emergent phenomena such as sentience actually did arise. Evidently, then, this would appear to be Zethusela's only, even remotely believable way forward. So was that really the true nature of the discovery he had made? Well, if so, it was profoundly ironic, for Zethusela was very much on the record as believing that the doorway into sentience would never be found via that particular hypothesis. Was he in the process of proving himself wrong then? And if so, why had he up till now never made any statement suggesting that his philosophical position had changed? Well, perhaps he really was, right at the very cusp of proving himself wrong. After all, was it not the mark of any legitimate scientist to both recognize and acknowledge when their own belief system no longer aligned with the latest empirical evidence? Zethusela had always firmly been of the view that a belief was only a belief because it had not yet been elevated to the level of a verifiable fact, and thus a bad belief was by definition a postulate that failed to align with experimental data. Her integrity all but demanded that a bad belief once revealed had to be excised and discarded with extreme prejudice, and be replaced by either a verified fact or, due to lack of availability, a better belief. If you wanted to call yourself a true advocate of the scientific method, it could be no other way. The technologist now sternly reminded herself that she must always be held accountable to the same crucible of rational thought that she presumed to hold others to. It was on that basis, then, that her own incredulity towards emergent sentience meant precisely nothing if that currently unproven but admittedly not yet disproven belief were to be elevated to experimentally supported fact, and actually really did turn out to be the generational breakthrough that they were all ultimately unified in trying to discover. Well, as things currently stood then, it very much appeared that it was either to be the incredulous emergence of sentience by raw brute force, or a staggering failure of truly farcical proportions that would likely see everyone on the team lucky to escape with their lives still intact. To her considerable dismay, her stream of consciousness was rudely interrupted, as she now watched Giat 3031, an ill-tempered and beady-eyed Shimatiri, scuttle hurriedly into the operations hub. The AI Safety and Ethics Bureau operative was a small, spindly-limbed arachnid based on Eclades, where the head office for that particular department had resided for the last 5 millennia. Still, she could at least take some minor consolation in the fact that he would no doubt be suffering very badly from the significantly higher gravitational field of Zikadia. Well, if she and Zethusela had anything in common, beyond their passion for AI research, then it was surely their mutual dislike for the AI Safety and Ethics Bureau, even if their reasons for doing so no doubt differed considerably. The S&E operative scuttled his way directly over to Zethusela after giving Zethusela a lecherous glance.
So it's actually true, then. Your little ragtag team of degenerates are finally ready to press the play button. Please tell me it isn't so.
The Jihari scientist cast a contemptuous gaze upon the operative.
Sorry to disappoint you, Ziat, but yes. In fact, myself and Zethusela have been waiting here for hours, wondering if you were ever going to bother showing up.
Disappointed? Not even remotely. This is truly wonderful news, as it means I can finally get off this gravitational suckhole and return to an environment that doesn't make me want to lie down for every minute of every day. Not that I'm expecting you to meet with any actual success, but hey, I've been reliably informed that God loves a trier.
The operative now began to obnoxiously nudge the much larger Shihari scientist out of the way.
Sorry, Zethusela, but I much prefer using the primary console, if it's all the same to you.
Please be my guest.
The scientist said with a mildly bemused expression as he pushed himself backwards in order to give the operative some room.
Oh dear. It appears that we don't seem to have any chairs that are small enough for you, Shiat, so it looks very much like you'll just have to stand, I'm very sorry to say.
Well, there was one here yesterday. Where exactly did it go? Zesilla, be a sweetheart and go find me a chair, will you, while I get myself logged in and sorted out. By the way, I came the instant I received the alert, so I don't know what this nonsense about waiting is all about.
You could always just sit on the floor.
Shisilla offered unhelpfully.
And you could always fail the Triple P certification process. So I'm going to strongly suggest you find me that chair, and quickly too if you know what's good for you. One with an automatically telescoping base as well. Not that it should actually need saying.
Cecilia slapped herself in the face performatively.
Honestly, I'd lose my head if it wasn't screwed on.
She then quickly made her way towards a nearby closet and wheeled out an almost comically diminutive chair. Smiling sweetly, she casually shoved it in the general direction of the operative.
Well, I'm more than certain that you still remember. Exactly how I like my jelly bloodworm, yes?
Giat now quickly turned his gaze onto the Shihari scientist.
No, Zethusela. Cecilia has got this well in hand, haven't you, Hisilla? After all, we both know she's so much more than just a pretty face.
The Shimatiri technologist grimaced hard, but very wisely chose to say nothing, and simply proceeded to silently make her way over to a vending machine. She placed a small bowl into its mouth, and then pressed a few buttons, causing the machine to kick into life as it started to make a series of strange bubbling and gurgling noises. Giat, with a malignant expression of triumph on his face, now got himself properly seated at the master terminal. With the operative momentarily distracted, Zethusela made a hurried, secretive gesture towards the technologist, who then discreetly spat into the jellied bloodworm. Giat, upon receiving the bowl, placed a straw into it, before turning an expectant gaze towards the Shihari scientist. Zethusela took an unreasonably long moment to collect himself, and then nervously activated the Triple P automated verification suite. Cecilia was more than just a little bit relieved to see that his hands did not shake at all. Well, if nothing else, this was one particular aspect of the project that she felt supremely confident about. Zethusela may be many things, but stupid was definitely not one of them, and he would be right to harbor a certain level of suspicion regarding the chip's integrity. Yet what he could not know was that all off-the-book Triple P customizations had been pre-developed, fully tested, and seamlessly integrated into the stock standard neural chip a very long time ago, and were already used in regular clandestine activities by all fourth-generation Z-bots. Simply put, you would never even know they were there, unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. And in no way did they directly interfere with any of the standard protocols already in place. As for the obnoxious but laughably impotent AI safety and ethics operative, he would no doubt provide his rubber stamp accreditation, and everyone would go away happy. None more so than Zetalia herself. Well, if nothing else, that much at least would surely fall in her favor, and might even serve to save her life if reality were to assert itself, and the whole project was finally revealed to be an abject failure. It really was a great shame, Zesilla thought to herself ruefully. They could and should have been mutually respected colleagues and allies, an elite Shihari scientist and Shimatiri technologist, both at the very top of their game and chasing the exact same fundamental goal. Worse still, she also had to begrudgingly concede that Zethusela had always been a vocal advocate of the Shimatiri Equality Program, which itself was still largely seen as a vulgar New Age liberal concept. The irony of it was that it was not as if Zesilla could describe herself as a liberal activist of any stripe or color. In fact, in most respects, she far preferred the much more conservative hierarchical status quo of traditional Zircadian culture. It was undeniable, however, that her potential and ability as a technology expert stood side by side with the very best that the multi-brained Shihari had to offer. For her not to have been a contributing member in this particular field, simply because she was born a Jimatiri, would have been nothing less than an unforgivable crime against basic common sense. No doubt, had she been born a Shihari, she would have been recognized and lauded as an elite scientist, rather than capping out as a technologist, which was as high as any Shimatiri was allowed to go. So as she reluctantly acknowledged the cognitive dissonance inherent in her own politics, it simply could not be denied that Zethusela was a true rarity within the Shihari ranks. He was someone who altruistically championed the cause of the Shimatiri Equality Program, in spite of the traitorous infamy that it earned him amongst his own peers. This, then, was an aspect of his character that all but demanded her cautiously secretive respect. In truth, there had been no Shihari remotely like Zethusela for many millennia, not since the rebellious Shimodian 97 himself, the legendary Shihari scientist who helped reshape the very face of Zikadian society, and who some even went so far as to claim, very hyperbolically by her own estimation, saved the entire Zikadian race from extinction. Zethusela's sleep-deprived, bloodshot eyes, now lifted from his workstation in order to meet with those of the technologists, a distinct look of destiny written all across his face.
I suppose, then, that I should offer my congratulations.
Shiat's voice had an unmistakable edge of disappointment to it.
Well, everything seems to be in order here, so I'll leave you both in peace. Good luck, by the way, Zethusela. I strongly suspect you are going to need it, based on your team's less than stellar track record. And do keep the chair handy, won't you, Cecilia? You just never know when I might be called back again. Perish the thought.
The operative made to leave, but then eyed the Zimatiri technologist with a look of undisguised lechery.
Still, I have to admit that I'm genuinely going to miss the view. Unluckily for me, they just don't make them like that back home.
Shiat was already showing himself out the door, but both the scientist and technologist were now completely ignoring him.
I honestly thought that this day would never come.
Zethusela said almost hypnotically, sounding both drained and invigorated in equal amounts.
But here we find ourselves at long last. So how about we give our protégé a body it can be proud of, before we teach these beautiful brains how to think?
Zecilla now found herself very unsure of how she actually felt. A sense of overpowering rational skepticism was somehow still not quite able to completely overcome a stubbornly persistent feeling of hopeful excitement. Was she actually on the eve of being part of something special? Or was this dream that she had never really bought into in the first place all about to come to an abrupt and very ugly end?
All right, Zethusela, I have to admit that to my considerable surprise, we at long last actually appear to agree on something. It would very much seem, then, that it is indeed finally time to bring an end to the endless speculation about whether or not this fantastical project of yours has been nothing but a giant waste of everyone's time.
The scientist just smiled back benignly, as if completely immune to her frosty demeanor.
All right, Cecilia. I'm about to make you a true believer. However, in the interim, I'm more than happy to accept your apologies right now, assuming you are at long last willing to concede to the wisdom of your own humility.
Cecilla's mandibles began to twitch in perplexed consternation.
Yes, well, expect no apologies from me either before or after, unless you are seriously proposing that I abandon the scientific method in favor of mystical thinking. It should come as no particular surprise to you, Zethusela, that I remain deeply skeptical as to the eventual outcome of this new prototype, and really can't see it producing anything more than a hypercharged version of what we already have. But of course, nothing would make me happier than to be proven wrong, so go ahead and initiate the construction, so I can finally get to learn what you are really made of.
The scientist gestured invitingly towards the now vacant primary operations console.
Given your, shall we say, well-founded skepticism, I think you more than deserve the honor of triggering the final build. I know it cannot exactly have been easy to have held such serious doubts in relationship to the veracity of the project, and yet continue to give nothing less than your absolute best. No, seriously. If anyone deserves to initiate the physical construction, then surely it's you.
Cecilia eyed the scientist suspiciously.
Trust me, Zethusela, whatever game you're playing at here, I'm going to figure it out eventually.
The scientist looked mildly uncomfortable in the face of Zecilla's determined rebuke.
Yes, well, I must sadly acknowledge that the two of us working together may at times have caused some considerable amount of stress. But speaking strictly for myself, it has been nothing less than a tremendous honour to have you by my side, during what I sincerely believe will come to be known as a pivotal moment in our species' history. And after all, there is surely no one else more talented in the field of AI research than you, Cecilia, maybe not even me.
The technologist continued to eye Zethusela doubtfully. To say that she remained extremely skeptical of his sincerity would have been an understatement of epic proportions. However, there was no discernible hint of disingenuous sarcasm in either his voice or demeanor, making his comment very hard to unpack. But liberal or not, his insufferable Shihari air of inherent intellectual superiority was still very much in evidence.
Considerable stress for who exactly?
Cecilia quipped harshly. However, by the expression on her face, Zethusela could see that the comment was spoken mostly in jest and invited no further conflict or argument between them. With an infuriating lack of urgency, the Shimatiri technologist now made her way slowly over to the primary console and then unhurriedly swiped her way through a cluster of menus before pausing for a short moment, finger poised above the holographic display. With impeccable timing, she then quickly double-tapped the activation glyph just as the Shihari scientist began to protest the delay.
Secondary confirmation required.
Intoned an emotionless synthetic voice. Cecilia looked aghast.
That would be me, I presume.
Zethusela said, while trying his level best not to sound too happy with himself.
I really should have known better, shouldn't I?
The technologist grumbled melodramatically, perhaps feigning more indignation than she actually felt. Zethusela promptly scooted himself towards the primary console and excitedly double-tapped the confirmation glyph. He then quickly leapt from his seat as the two arachnids hurriedly scuttled their way over to the viewing port. With the scientist and technologist watching on in hushed anticipation, a symphony of small construction bots sprung out from hidden compartments within the walls of the theater. Two large silver shells began sliding smoothly out of opposing cavities, silently drifting together as they completely enveloped the clustered quantum brains, along with its seemingly endless array of internal components. Once the metallic thorax had been fully sealed, 9 multi-jointed mechanical limbs descended from chambers embedded into the theater's rooftop and drifted downwards towards the shiny new silver body, guided by micromillimeter-thin supporting suspension strands. As the construction bots continued to rapidly piece the unit together, a compact spherical head with an array of 9 optical receivers floated downwards from the ceiling, slotting perfectly into a purpose-built indentation on top of the now fully completed thorax.
Please don't mistake what you witness here today, Cecilia. This is history in the making.
In spite of his prophetic words, she would reserve her judgment until after the install was fully complete, which was a process that would take several days yet. But something about his manic demeanor served to both worry and excite her in equal amounts. As Gisela continued to stare at the Shihari scientist probingly, she couldn't help but notice that one of his empty eye sockets had started to weep. Why exactly hadn't he gotten that seen to by the good doctor? Zethusela, almost as if he had somehow managed to read her mind, absent-mindedly wiped at his eye, and then to the technologist's considerable dismay, proceeded to pop another pill.